Happy snow day, guys. As I said in my text this morning, sometimes it's nice to be wrong. But I think Worcester got way more than Ashland did. I'm not super sure, though. I'll start reading in about 5 minutes. I just like to give people time in case they do want to get on. And we have a lot of reading to do today. I didn't realize when I promised this last night that I'd be reading like 30 pages. So I don't mind. It doesn't bother me at all. I mean, I have to work at 4, but what else am I doing today? Except maybe working on your next unit. Get excited. I guess I could show you the view from my window here on my street, if you're interested. The only people I've met on my street are literally just the people that live straight across from me and right next to me.
Just like that.
All right, guys, we're going to get started with the reading. So if you're reading along with me and you have your books, like you brought them home because you thought we were going to have a snow day, or you didn't bring them home because you thought we were going to have a snow day, we are going to be starting on page 291. We're going to be reading to page 318 today. That'll take care of chapters 23 and 24. And if you are not aware, we are actually finishing this novel next Monday, which is crazy. I cannot believe we finished this in 3 weeks. I know it's been a lot of reading, and I apologize for that, but I hope between listening and live streaming and giving you time that it has been manageable, or at least slightly manageable. Like I said, I do apologize. All right, so you should be on page 291. All right. I wish Bob Ewell wouldn't chew tobacco, was all Atticus said about it. And according to Miss Stephanie Crawford, however, Atticus was leaving the post office when Mr. Ewell approached him, cursed him, spat on him, and threatened to kill him. Miss Stephanie, who by the time she had told it twice was there, had seen it all, passing by from the jitney jungle. She was. Miss Stephanie said Atticus did not bat an eye, just took out his handkerchief, wiped his face, and stood there, and let Mr. Ewell call him names wild horses could not bring her to repeat. Mr. Ewell was a veteran of obscure war. That plus Atticus's peaceful reaction probably prompted him to inquire, "Too proud to fight, you nigger-loving bastard?" Miss Stephanie said, "Atticus? No, too old," put his hands in his pockets, and strolled on. Miss Stephanie said, you had to hand it to Atticus Finch. He could be right dry sometimes. Jem and I didn't think it entertaining. "After all, though," I said, "he was the deadest shot in the county at one time. He could, you know, he wouldn't carry a gun, Scout." "He ain't even got one," said Jem. "You know, he didn't even have one down in the jail that night. He told me having a gun around's an invitation for somebody to shoot you." "That's different," I said. "We can ask him to borrow one." We did, and he said nonsense. Dill was of the opinion that an appeal to Atticus's better nature might work. After all, we would starve if Mr. Ewell killed him. Besides, be raised exclusively by Aunt Alexandra, and we all knew the first thing she'd do before Atticus was under the ground, good, would be to fire Calpurnia. Jem said it might work if I cried and flung a fit. Being young and a girl, that didn't work either. But when he noticed us dragging around the neighborhood, not eating, taking little interest in our normal pursuits, Atticus discovered how deeply frightened we were. He tempted Jem with a new football magazine one night. When he saw Jem flip the pages and toss it aside, he said, "What's bothering you, son?" Jem came to the point. "Mr. Ewell." "What has happened?" "Nothing's happened. We're scared for you, and we think you ought to do something about him." Atticus smiled wryly. "Do what? Put him in a peace bond?" "When a man says he's going to get you, looks like he means it." He meant it when he said it," said Atticus. "Jem, see if you can stand Bob Ewell's shoes for a minute. I destroyed his last shred of credibility at this trial, if he had any to begin with. The man had to do some kind of comeback. His kind always does. So spitting in my face and threatening me saved Mayella one extra beating. That's something I'll gladly take. He had to take it out on somebody, and I'd rather it be me than a house full of children there. You understand?" Jem nodded. Aunt Alexandra entered the room as Atticus was saying, "You don't have anything to fear from Bob Ewell. He got it all out of his system this morning." "I wouldn't be so sure of that, Atticus," she said. His kind will do anything to pay off a grudge. You know how those people are." "What on earth could Ewell do to me, sister?" "Something furtive," Aunt Alexandra said. "You might count on that." Nobody has much of a chance to be furtive and make them," Atticus answered. After that, we were not afraid. Summer was melting away, and we made the most of it. Atticus assured us that nothing would happen to Tom Robinson until a higher court reviewed his case, and that Tom had a good chance of going free, or at least of having a new trial. He was at Enfield Prison Farm, 70 miles in Chester County. I asked Atticus if Tom's wife and children were allowed to visit him, but Atticus said no. "If he loses his appeal," I asked one evening, "what will happen to him?" "He'll go to the chair," said Atticus, "unless the governor commutes his sentence." "No time to worry yet, Scout. We've got a good chance." Jem was sprawled on the sofa reading Popular Mechanics. He looked up. "It ain't right. He didn't kill anybody, even if he was guilty. He didn't take anybody's life." "You know rape's a capital offense in Alabama," said Atticus. "Yes, sir, but the jury didn't have to give him death. If they wanted to, they could have given him 20 years. Gave him 20 years. Given," said Atticus. "Tom Robinson's a colored man, Jem. No jury in this part of the world's going to say we think you're guilty, but not very, on a charge of something like that. It was either straight acquittal or nothing." Jem was shaking his head. "I know it's not right, but I can't figure out what's wrong. Maybe rape shouldn't be a capital offense." Atticus dropped his newspaper beside his chair. He said he didn't have any quarrel with the rape statute, none whatever. But he did have deep misgivings when the state asked for and the jury gave a death penalty on a purely circumstantial evidence. He glanced at me, saw I was listening, and made it easier. I mean, before a man is sentenced to death for murder, say there should be 1 or 2 eyewitnesses. Somebody should be able to say, yes, I was there, and I saw him pull the trigger. But lots of folks have been hanged on circumstantial evidence, said Jem. I know, and lots of them probably deserved it too, but in the absence of eyewitnesses, there's always a doubt, sometimes only the shadow of a doubt. The law says reasonable doubt, but I think a defendant's entitled to the shadow of a doubt. There's always the possibility that no matter how improbable he is innocent, that it all goes back to the jury. We ought to do away with juries, said Jem, adamant. Atticus tried hard not to smile, but could not help it. You're rather hard on us, son. I think maybe there might be a better way. Change the law. Change it so that only judges have the power of fixing the penalty in the capital states. Then go up to Montgomery and change the law. You'd be surprised how hard that'd be. I won't live to see the law changed, and if you live to see it, you'll be an old man. This was not good enough for Jem. No, sir, they ought to do away with juries. He wasn't guilty in the first place, and they said he was. If you had been on that jury, son, and 11 other boys like you, Tom would be a free man, said Atticus. So far, nothing in your life has interfered with your reasoning process. Those are 12 reasonable men in everyday life. Tom's jury. But you saw something come between them and reason. You saw the same thing that night in the front of the jail when that crew went away, and they didn't go as reasonable men. They went because we were there. There's something in our world that makes men lose their heads. They couldn't be fair if they tried. In our courts, when it's a white man's word against a black man's, the white man always wins. They're ugly, but those are the facts of life. Doesn't make it right, said Jem stolidly. He beat his fist softly on his knee. You just can't convict a man on evidence like that. You just can't. You couldn't, but they could, and they did. The older you grow and the more you'll see it. The one place where a man ought to get a square deal is the courtroom, be he any color of the rainbow. But people have a way of carrying their resentments right to the jury box. As you grow older, you'll see white men cheat black men every day of your life. But let me tell you something, and don't you forget it. Whatever a white man does to a black man, no matter who he is, how rich he is, or how fine that family comes from, that white man is trash. Atticus was speaking so quietly that his last word crashed into our ears. I looked up and his face was vehement. There's nothing more sickening to me than a low-grade white man who will take advantage of a Negro's ignorance. Don't fool yourselves. It's all adding up, and one of these days we're going to pay the bill for it. I hope it's not in your children's time. Atticus was scratching his head. Suddenly his eyes widened. Atticus, he said, why don't people like us and Miss Maudie ever sit on juries? You never see anybody from May come on a jury. They all come from out in the woods. Atticus leaned back in his rocking chair for some reason. He looked pleased with Jem. I was wondering when that occurred to you. He said, there are lots of reasons. For one thing, Miss Maudie can't serve on a jury because she's a woman. You mean women in Alabama can't? I was indignant. I do. I guess it's to protect our frail ladies from sordid cases like Tom's. Besides, Atticus grinned, I doubt if we'd ever get a complete case tried, the ladies be interrupting to ask questions. Jem and I laughed. Miss Maudie on a jury would be impressive, and I thought of old Mrs. DeBose in her wheelchair. Stop that rapping, John Taylor. I want to ask this man something. Perhaps our forefathers were wise, Atticus was saying, with people like us. That's our share of the bill. We generally get juries we deserve. Our stout make-em citizens aren't interested in the first place. And in the second place, they're afraid. They're afraid of what? Asked Jem. Well, what if, say, Mr. Link Dees had to decide the amount of damages to award? Say Miss Maudie, when Miss Rachel ran over her with a car. Link wouldn't like the thought of losing either lady's business at his store, would he? So he tells Judge Taylor that he can't serve on the jury because he doesn't have anybody to keep the store for him while he's gone. So Judge Taylor excuses him. Sometimes he excuses him wrathfully. What'd make him think either one of them stopped training with him? I asked. Jem said, Miss Rachel would, Miss Maudie wouldn't, but a jury's vote's secret, Atticus. Our father chuckled. You've got many more miles to go, son. A jury's vote's supposed to be secret. Serving on a jury forces a man to make up his mind and declare himself about something. Men don't like to do that. Sometimes it's unpleasant. Tom's jury show made up its mind in a hurry, Jem muttered. Atticus's fingers went to his watch pocket. No, it didn't, he said, more to himself than to us. That was the one thing that made me think, well, this may be the shadow of a beginning. The jury took a few hours, an inevitable verdict, maybe, but usually it takes him just a few minutes. This time, he broke off and looked at us. You might like to know that there was one fellow who took considerable wearing down. In the beginning, he was rarin' for an outright acquittal. Sounds really similar to something else we read in school. Who? Jem was astonished. Atticus's eyes twinkled. It's not for me to say, but I'll tell you this much. He was one of your old Sarum friends. One of the Cunninghams? Jem yelled. One of the... I didn't recognize any of them. You're joking. He looked at Atticus from the corners of his eyes. One of their connections, on a hunch. I didn't strike him, just on a hunch. Could have, but I didn't. Golly, Moses, said Jem reverently. 1 minute they're trying to kill him, the next they're trying to turn him loose. I'll never understand these folks as long as I live. Atticus said you just had to know him. He said the Cunninghams hadn't taken anything from or off anybody since they migrated to the New World. He said the other thing about them was that once you earned their respect, that they were there for you tooth and nail. Atticus said he had had a feeling, nothing more than a suspicion, and they left the jail that night with considerable respect for the Finches. Then, too, he said it was a thunderbolt plus another Cunningham to make one of them change his mind. If we had had two of that crowd, we might have had a hung jury. Jem said slowly, You mean you actually put on a jury a man who You mean you actually put on the jury a man who wanted to kill you the night before? How could you take such a risk, Atticus? How could you? When you analyze it, there was a little risk. There's no difference between one man and one who's going to convict and another man who's going to convict, is there? There's a faint difference between a man who's going to convict and a man who's a little disturbed in his mind, isn't there? He was the only uncertainty on the whole list. What kin was that man to Mr. Walter Cunningham? I asked. Atticus rose, stretched, and yawned. It was not even our bedtime, but he knew we wanted a chance to read his newspaper. He picked it up, folded it up, and tapped me on the head. Let's see now, he droned himself. I've got it. Double first cousin? How can that be? Two sisters married to brother. That's all I'll tell you. You figure it out. I tortured myself and decided that if I married Jem and Dill had a sister whom he married, our children would be double first cousins. Gee mighty, Jem, I said, when Atticus had gone. They're funny folks. Do you hear that, Auntie? Aunt Alexandra was hooking a rug and not watching us, but she was listening. She sat on her chair with her work basket beside her, her rug spread across her lap. Why ladies hooked woolen rugs on boiling nights never became clear to me. I heard, she said. I remember the distant, disastrous occasion when I rushed to young Walter Cunningham's defense. Now I was glad that I had done it. School starts soon. I'm going to ask Walter home for dinner, I planned, having forgotten my private resolve to beat him up after the next time I saw him. He can stay over sometimes after school, too. Atticus could drive him back to Old Sarum. Maybe he could spend the night with us sometime, okay, Jem? We'll see about that, Aunt Alexandra said. A declaration with her was always a threat, never a promise. Surprised, I turned to her. Why not, Auntie? They're good folks. She looked at me over her sewing glasses. Jean Louise, there is no doubt in my mind that they're good folks, but they're not our kind of folks. Jem says she means they're yappy, Scout. What's a yap? Tacky. Like they're like fiddling with and things like that. Well, I do too. Don't be silly, Jean Louise, said Aunt Alexandra. The thing is, you can scrub Walter Cunningham till he shines and put him in new shoes and a suit, but he'll never be like Jem. Because besides, there's a drinking streak in that family that a mile wide. Finch women aren't interested in that sort of people. Auntie, said Jem, she's not even 9 yet. She may as well learn it now. Aunt Alexandra had spoken. I was reminded vividly of that time she had put her foot down. I never knew why. It was when I was absorbed with plans to visit Calpurnia's house. I was curious, interested. I wanted to be her company, to see how she lived, who her friends were. I might as well have wanted to see the other side of the moon. This time the tactics were different, but Aunt Alexandra's aim was the same. Perhaps this was why she had come to live with us, or help us to choose our friends, in order to help us choose our friends. I would hold her off as long as I could. If they're good folks, why can't I be nice to Walter? I didn't say not to be nice to him. You should be friendly and polite to him. You should be gracious to everybody. But you don't have to invite him home. What if he was kin to us, Auntie? The fact is that he's not kin to us. But if he were, my answer would be the same. Auntie, Jem spoke up. Atticus says you can choose your friends, but you can't choose your family. They're still kin no matter and you can't choose their family. They're still kin to you no matter whether you acknowledge him or not. It makes you look right silly when you don't. That's your father all over again, said Aunt Alexandra. And I still say that Jean Louise will not invite Walter Cunningham to this house. If he were her double first cousin once removed, he would still not be received in this house unless he comes to see Atticus on business. Now that is that. She had said indeed not, but this time she would give her reasons. But I want to play with Walter, Auntie. Why can't I? She took off her glasses and stared at me. I'll tell you why, she said. Because he is trash. That's why. That's why you can't play with him. I'll not have you around him, picking up his habits, learning Lord knows what. You're enough of a problem to your father as is. I don't know what I would have done, but Jem stopped me. He caught me by the shoulders and put his arm around me and led me sobbing in fury to his bedroom. Atticus heard us and poked his head around the door. It's all right, sir, Jem said gruffly. It's not anything. Atticus went away. Have a chew, Scout. Jem dug in his pocket and extracted a Tootsie Roll. It took a few minutes to work the candy into a comfortable wad inside of my jaw. Jem was rearranging the objects on his dresser, his hair stuck up behind and down in the front, and I wondered if it would ever look like a man's. Maybe if he shaved it off and started over, his hair would grow back neatly in place. His eyebrows were becoming heavier, and I noticed a new slimness in his body. He was growing taller. When he looked around, he must have thought I would start crying again, for he said, "Show you something if you won't tell anybody." I said, "What?" He unbuttoned his shirt, grinning shyly. "Well, what?" "Well, can't you see it?" "Well, no." "Well, it's a hair." "Where?" "There, right there." He had been a comfort to me, so I said it looked lovely, but I didn't see anything. "It's real nice, Jim." "Under my arms, too," he said. "Going out for football next year, Scout. Don't let Auntie aggravate you." It seemed only yesterday that he was telling me not to aggravate Auntie. "You know, she's not used to girls," said Jem. "Leastways, not girls like you. She's trying to make you a lady. Can't you take up sewing or something?" "Hell no! She doesn't like me, and that's all there is to it, and I don't care. It was her calling Walter Cunningham trash that got me going. Jem, not what she said about being a problem to Atticus. We got all that straight one time. I asked him if I was a problem, and he said not much of one. At most, one that he could always figure out, and not to worry my head a second about bothering him. Nah, it was Walter. That boy is not trash, Jem. He ain't like the Yules." Jem kicked off his shoes and swung his feet to the bed. He propped himself against a pillow and switched on his reading light. "You know something, Scout? I've got it all figured out now. I thought about it a lot lately, and I've got it figured out. There's 4 kinds of folks in this world. There's the ordinary kind like us, and their neighbors, and the neighbors. Then there's the kind like the Cunninghams out in the woods, and the kind like the Yules down at the dump, and then the Negroes. And what about the Chinese and the Cajuns down yonder in Baldwin County? I mean in Macomb County. The thing about it is our kind of folks don't like the Cunninghams. The Cunninghams don't like the Yules, and the Yules hate and despise the colored folks." I told Jem if that was so, why wasn't Tom's jury made up of folks like the Cunninghams acquit Tom despite the Yules? Jem waved my question away as being infantile. "You know what he said? I've seen Atticus pat his foot when he's fiddling with the radio, and he loves pot liquor better than any man I saw." "Then what makes us like the Cunninghams?" "Then that makes us like the Cunninghams," I said. "I can't see why Auntie—" "No, let me finish. It does, but we're still different somehow. Atticus said one time the reason Auntie's so hipped on the family is because we've all got our background and not a dime to our names." "Well, Jem, I don't know. Atticus told me once that most of this is old family stuff, foolishness, because everybody's family is just as old as everybody else's." I said, "Did that include the colored folks and the Englishmen?" And he said, "Yes." "Background doesn't mean old family," said Jem. "I think it's how long your family's been reading and writing, Scout. I've studied this real hard, and there's only one reason I can think of. Somewhere along the line, the Finches were in Egypt. One of them must have learned a hieroglyphic or 2 and taught his boy." Jem laughed. "Imagine Auntie being proud of her great-granddaddy could read and write." Ladies pick funny things to be proud of. "Well, I'm glad he could, or who would have taught Atticus and them? And if Atticus couldn't read, you and me'd be in a fix." "I don't think that's what background is, Jem." Well, then how do you explain why the Cunninghams are different?" "Mr. Walter can hardly sign his name. I've seen him. We've just been reading and writing longer than they have. No, everybody's got to learn. Everybody's born knowing. That Walter's as smart as he can be. He just gets held back sometimes because he has to stay out and help his daddy. Nothing's wrong with him. Nah, Jem, I think there's just one kind of folks." Jem turned his back around and punched his pillow. When he settled back, his face was cloudy. He was going in one of his declines, and I grew wary. His brows came together. His mouth became a thin line. He was silent for a while. That's what I thought too, he said at last. When I was your age, if there was one kind of folks, why can't we all just get along with one another? If they're all alike, why do we go out of our way to hate one another, Scout? I think I'm beginning to understand something. I think I'm beginning to understand why Boo Radley stayed shut in his house all this time. It's because he wants to stay inside. Chapter 24. Calpurnia wore her stiffest starched apron. She carried a tray of Charlotte. She backed up the swinging door and pressed gently. I admired the ease and grace with which she had handled heavy loads of dainty things. So did Aunt Alexandra, I guess, because she had to let Calpurnia serve today. August was on the brink of September. Dill would be leaving for Meriden tomorrow. Today he was off with Jem at Baker's Eddy. Jem had discovered with angry amazement that nobody had ever bothered to teach Dill how to swim, a skill Jem considered necessary as walking. They had spent 2 afternoons at the creek. They said they were going in naked, and so I couldn't come. So I divided the lonely hours between Calpurnia and Miss Maudie. Today, Aunt Alexandra and her missionary circle were fighting the good fight all over our house. From the kitchen, I heard Mrs. Grace Merriweather giving a report to the living room on the squalid lives of the Myrnas, it sounded like to me. They put women out in the huts when it came their time, whatever that was. They had no sense of family. I knew they'd distress Auntie. They subjected children to terrible ordeals, and when they were 13, they were crawling with yaws and earworms. They chewed up and spat out the bark of a tree into a communal pot, and men got drunk on it. Immediately thereafter, the ladies adjourned for refreshments. I didn't know whether to go to the dining room or stay out. Aunt Alexandra told me to join them for refreshments, but it was not necessary that I attend the business part of the meeting. She said it'd bore me. I was wearing my pink Sunday dress, shoes, and a petticoat, and reflected that if I spilled anything, Calpurnia would have to wash my dress again for tomorrow. This had been a busy day for her. I decided to stay put. Can I help you, Cal? I asked, wishing to be of some service. Calpurnia paused in the doorway. You be still as a mouse in that corner, she said, and you can help me load up the trays when I come back. The gentle hum of the ladies' voices grew louder as she opened the door. Why, Aunt Alexandra, I never saw such Charlotte, just lovely. I can never get my crust like this. Never can. Who'd have thought that little dewberry tarts? Calpurnia? Who'd have thought it? Anybody tell you that the preacher's wife? No. Well, she is. Well, she is, and that other one's not walking yet. They became quiet, and I knew they had all been served. Calpurnia turned and put her mother's heavy silver pitcher on a tray. This coffee pitcher's a curiosity, she murmured. They don't make them these days. Can I carry it in? If you be careful and don't drop it, set it down at the end of the table by Aunt Alexandra, down there by the cups and things. She's going to pour. I tried pressing my behind against the door, as Calpurnia had done, but the door didn't budge. Grinning, she held it open for me. Careful now, it's heavy. Don't look at it, and you won't spill it. My journey was successful. Aunt Alexandra smiled brilliantly. Stay with us, Jean Louise, she said. This was part of her campaign to teach me how to be a lady. It was customary for every circle hostess to invite her neighbors in for refreshments, be them Baptists or Presbyterians, which accounted for the presence of Miss Rachel, sober as a judge, Miss Maudie, and Miss Stephanie Crawford. Rather nervous, I took a seat beside Miss Maudie and wondered why ladies put on their hats to go across the street. Ladies in bunches always filled me with vague apprehension and a firm desire to be elsewhere, but this feeling was what Aunt Alexandra called being spoiled. The ladies were cool in fragile pastel prints, most of them heavily powdered but unrouged. The only lipsticks in the room was Tangy Natural. Q-Tex Natural sparkled on their fingernails, but some of the younger ladies wore rose. They smelled heavenly, and I sat quietly, having conquered my hands by tightly gripping the arms of the chair and waiting for someone to speak to me. Miss Maudie's gold bridgework twinkled. You're mighty dressed up, Jean Louise, she said. Where are your breeches today? Under my dress. I hadn't meant to be funny, but the ladies laughed. My cheeks grew hot as I realized my mistake, but Miss Maudie looked gravely down at me. She never laughed at me unless I meant to be funny. In a sudden silence that followed, Miss Stephanie Crawford called from across the room. What you going to be when you grow up, Jean Louise? A lawyer? No, I hadn't thought about it, I answered, grateful that Miss Stephanie was kind enough to change the subject. Hurriedly, I began to choose my vocation. Nurse, aviator, well, why shoot. I thought you'd want to be a lawyer. You've already commenced going to court. The ladies laughed again. That Stephanie's a card, somebody said. Miss Stephanie encouraged to pursue the subject. Don't you want to grow up to be a lawyer? Miss Maudie's hand touched mine, and I answered mildly enough. No, I'm just a lady. Miss Stephanie eyed me suspiciously and decided that I meant no impertinence and contented herself with, well, you don't have to go very far until you start wearing dresses more often. You won't get very far until you start wearing dresses more often. Miss Maudie's hand closed tightly on mine, and I said nothing. Its warmth was enough. Mrs. Grace Merriweather sat on my left, and I felt it would be polite to ask her. Mrs. Merriweather, a faithful Methodist under duress, apparently saw nothing personal in singing Amazing Grace, How Sweet the Sound that saved a wretch like me. It was the general opinion of Maycomb, however, that Mrs. Merriweather had sobered him up. Oh, sorry. Mr. Merriweather was a faithful Methodist. She straightened him out. For certainly Mrs. Merriweather was the most devout lady in Maycomb. I searched for a topic of interest to her. What did you all study this afternoon? I asked. Oh, child, those poor Myrnas, she said, and was off. A few other questions would be necessary. Mrs. Merriweather's large brown eyes always filled with tears when she considered the oppressed, living in that jungle with nobody but J. Grimes Everett, she said. Not a white person will go near him, but that saintly J. Grimes Everett. Mrs. Merriweather played her voice like an organ. Every word she said received its full measure. The poverty, the darkness, the immortality, nobody but J. Grimes Everett knows. You know, when the church gave me that trip to the campgrounds, J. Grimes Everett says to me, was he there, ma'am? I thought, home on leave. J. Grimes Everett said to me, he said, Mrs. Merriweather, you have no conception of what we are fighting over there. That's what he said to me. Yes, ma'am. I said to him, Mr. Everett, I said, the ladies of the Maycomb, Alabama Methodist Episcopal Church of the South are behind you 100%. And that's what I said to him. And you know what? Right there, right then and there, I made a pledge in my heart. I said to myself that when I go home, I'm going to give a course on the Myrnas and bring J. Grimes Everett's message to Maycomb. And that's just what I'm doing. Yes, ma'am. When Mrs. Merriweather shook her head and her black curls jiggled, Jean Louise, she said, you are a fortunate girl. You live in a Christian home with Christian folks in a Christian town. Out there in J. Grimes Everett's land, there's nothing but sin and squalor. Yes, ma'am. Sin and squalor. What was that, Gertrude? Mrs. Merriweather turned on her chimes for a lady sitting beside her. Oh, that. Well, I always say forgive and forget. Forgive and forget. The thing that church ought to do is help her lead a Christian life for those children from here on out. Some of the men ought to go out there and tell the preacher to encourage her. Excuse me, Mrs. Merriweather. Are you talking about Miss Mayhew? No, Tom, the darkey's wife. Tom's wife, Tom Robinson, ma'am. Mrs. Merriweather turned back to her neighbor. That's one thing I truly believe, Gertrude, she continued, but some people just don't see it that way. If we just let them know that we forgive them, that we've forgotten it, that the whole thing will blow over. Mrs. Merriweather, I interrupted once more. What will blow over? Again, she turned to me. Mrs. Merriweather was one of those childless adults who find it necessary to assume a different tone of voice when speaking to children. Nothing, Jean Louise, she said in a stately largo. The cooks and the field hands are just dissatisfied. But they're settling down now. They've grumbled all day after that trial. Mrs. Merriweather faced Mrs. Farrow. Gertrude, I'll tell you, there's nothing more distracting than a sulky darky. Their eyes go down to here. Just ruins your day to have one of them in the kitchen. You know what? I said to my Sophie, Gertrude, I said, Sophie, I said, you simply are not being a Christian today. Jesus Christ never went around grumbling and complaining. And you know it. It did her good. She took her eyes off that floor and said, no, Miss Merriweather, Jesus never went around grumbling. I tell you, Gertrude, you never ought to let an opportunity go by to witness for the Lord. I was reminded of that ancient little organ in the chapel at Finch's Landing when I was very small, and it had been very good to me during the day. Atticus would let me pump it, and if I had been very good during the day, Atticus would let me pump its bellows while he picked out a tune with one finger. The last note would linger as long as there was air to sustain it. Mrs. Merriweather had run out of air, I judged, and was replenishing her supply when Mrs. Farrow composed herself to speak. Mrs. Farrow was a splendidly built woman with pale eyes and narrow feet. She had fresh pavement, permanent wave, and her hair was a mass of tight gray ringlets. She was the second most devout lady in Maycomb. She had a curious habit of prefacing everything she said with soft, sibilant sound. "'Sgrace," she said. "It's like I was telling Brother Huston the other day." "'Brother Huston," I said. "Looks like we're fighting a losing battle." "A losing battle," I said. "Doesn't matter. One bit to him, one bit. We can still educate him till we're blue in the face. We can try till we drop to make Christians out of him, but there's no safe lady in her bed these nights." He said to me, "Mrs. Farrow, I don't know what we're coming to down here." That's what I told him. That was certainly fact. Mrs. Merriweather nodded wisely. Her voice soared over the clink of the coffee cups and the soft bovine sounds of ladies munching on their dainties. "Gertrude," she said, I'll tell you, there are some good but misguided people in this town. Good but misguided. Folks in this town think they're doing right. Now far be it for me to say who, but some of them in this town thought that we were doing the right thing a while back. But all they did was stir them up. That's all they did. Might have looked like a right thing to do at the time. I'm sure I don't know. Only 5 pages left. I'm not ready. I'm not red in that field, but sulky and dissatisfied. I tell you, if my Sophie kept it up another day, I'd have to let her go. It's never entered the wool of hers that the only reason I kept her is because this depression's going on and she needs $1.25 each week that she can get. His food doesn't stick to going down, does it? Miss Maudie said it. 2 tight lines had appeared in the corners of her mouth. She had been sitting silently behind me, her coffee cup balanced on one knee. I had lost the thread of conversation long ago when they quit talking about Tom Robinson's wife and had contented myself with thinking about Finch's Landing in the river. Aunt Alexandra had got it backwards. The business part of the meeting was blood-curdling. The social hour was dreary. Maudie, I'm sure I don't know what you mean, said Mrs. Merriweather. I'm sure you do, said Miss Maudie shortly. She said no more. When Miss Maudie was angry, her brevity was icy. Something had made her deeply angry, and her gray eyes were as cold as her voice. Miss Merriweather reddened, glanced at me, and looked away. I could not see Mrs. Varro. Aunt Alexandra got up from the table and swiftly passed more refreshments, neatly engaging Mrs. Merriweather and Mrs. Gates in brisk conversation. When she had them well on the road with Mrs. Perkins, Aunt Alexandra stepped back. She gave Miss Maudie a look of pure gratitude. I wondered at the world of women. Miss Maudie and Aunt Alexandra had never been especially close, and here was Auntie silently thanking her for something. For what I knew not, I was content to learn that Aunt Alexandra could be pierced sufficiently to feel gratitude for help given. There was no doubt about it. I must soon enter this world, where on its surface fragrant ladies rocked slowly, fanned gently, and drank cool water. But I was more at home in my father's world. People like Mr. Heck Tate did not trap you with innocent questions to make fun of you. Even Jem was not highly critical unless you said something stupid. Ladies seemed to live in faint horror of men, seemed unwilling to approve wholeheartedly of men, but I liked them. There was something about them, no matter how much they cussed and drank and gambled and chewed, no matter how undelectable they were, there was something about them that I instinctively liked. They weren't hypocrites, Mrs. Perkins, born hypocrites. Mrs. Merriweather was saying, at least we don't have that sin on our shoulders down here. People up there, set them free, but you don't see them sitting at the table with them. At least we don't have the deceit to say to them, yes, you're good as we are, but stay away from us. Down here, we just say, you live your way and we'll live ours. I think that Mrs. Roosevelt's losing her mind. Just plain lost her mind coming down to Birmingham and trying to sit with them. If I was mayor of Birmingham, neither of us was mayor of Birmingham, but I wished I was governor of Alabama for one day. I'd let Tom Robinson go so quick the missionary society wouldn't have time to catch its breath. Calpurnia was telling Miss Rachel's cook the other day how bad Tom was taking things, and she didn't stop talking when I came to the kitchen. She said there wasn't a thing Atticus could do to make being shut up easier for him. You're very close. That the last thing he said to Atticus before they took him down to the prison camp was, goodbye, Mr. Finch. There ain't nothing you can do now, so there ain't no use trying. Calpurnia said Atticus told her that day they took Tom to prison, he just gave up hope. She said Atticus tried to explain things to him, that he must do his best not to lose hope, because Atticus was doing his best to get him free. Miss Rachel's cook asked Calpurnia, why didn't Atticus just say, yes, you'll go free and leave it at that? It seemed like it would be a big comfort to Tom. Calpurnia said, because you ain't familiar with the law. First thing you learn when you're law and family is that there ain't definite answers to anything. Mr. Finch wouldn't say something so he doesn't know if it's sure to say so. The front door slammed and I heard Atticus's footsteps in the hall. Automatically, I wondered what time it was, not nearly time for him to be home. And on the Missionary Society days, he usually stayed downtown until it was black dark outside. He stopped at the doorway, hid the hat in his hands. His face was white. Excuse me, lady, he said. Go right ahead with your meeting. Don't let me disturb you. Alexander, could you come into the kitchen for a minute? I want to borrow Calpurnia for a while. He didn't go through the dining room, but went down the back hallway and entered the kitchen from the rear. Aunt Alexandra and I met him. The dining room door opened again, and Miss Maudie joined us. Calpurnia was half risen from her chair. Cal, Atticus said, I want you to go out with me to Helen Robinson's house. What's the matter? Aunt Alexandra asked, alarmed by the look on my father's face. Tom's dead. Aunt Alexandra put her hands to her mouth. They shot him, said Atticus. He was running. It was during their exercise period. They said he just broke into a blind, raving charge at the fence and started climbing over it, right in front of them. Didn't they try to stop him? Didn't they give him any warning? Yeah, the guards called him told him to stop. They fired a few shots into the air, then to kill. They got him just as he went over the fence. They said if he had had 2 guard arms, he would have made it. He was moving that fast. 17 bullet holes in him. They didn't have to shoot him so much, Cal. I want you to come with me to help tell Helen. Yes, sure, sir, she murmured, fumbling with her apron. Miss Maudie went to Calpurnia and untied it. This is the last straw, Atticus, Aunt Alexander said. Depends on how you look at it, he said. What was one Negro, more or less, among 200 of them? He wasn't Tom to them. He was an escaping prisoner. Atticus leaned against the refrigerator, pushed his glasses, and rubbed his eyes. We had such a good chance, he said. I told him I thought, but I couldn't in truth say we had more than a good chance. I guess Tom was tired of white men's chances and preferred to take his own. You ready, Cal? Yes, sir, Mr. Finch. Then let's go. Aunt Alexandra sat down in Calpurnia's chair and put her hands to her face. She sat quite still. She was so quiet that I wondered if she would faint. I heard Miss Maudie breathing as if she had just climbed up the steps, and in the dining room the ladies chattered happily. I thought Aunt Alexandra was crying, but when she took her hands away from her face, she was not. She looked very weary. She spoke, and her voice was flat. I can't say I approve of everything he does, Maudie. He's my brother, and I just want to know that when this will ever end. Her voice rose. It tears into pieces. He doesn't show it much, but it tears into pieces. I've seen him when... What else do they want from him, Maudie? What else? What does who want, Alexandra and Miss Maudie asked. I mean this town. They're perfectly willing to let him do what they're too afraid of them to do themselves. It might lose them a nickel. They're perfectly willing to let him wreck his health, what they're going to do when they're... Be quiet, they'll hear you, said Miss Maudie. Have you ever thought of it this way, Aunt Alexandra? Whether Maycomb knows it or not, we're paying the highest tribute we can pay a man. We trust him to do right. It's that simple. Who? Aunt Alexandra never knew she was echoing her 12-year-old nephew. The handful of people in this town who say that fair play is not marked white only. The handful of people who say a fair trial is for everybody, not just us. The handful of people who have with enough humility to think, when they look at a Negro, they're there, but for the Lord's kindness am I. Miss Maudie's old crispness was returning. The handful of people in this town with background, that's who they are. Had I been attentive, I would have had another scrap to add to Jem's definition of background, but I found myself shaking and I couldn't stop. I had seen Enfield Prison Farm, and Atticus had pointed out the exercise yard to me. It was the size of a football field. Stop that shaking, commanded Miss Maudie. Get up, Alexandra. We've left him long enough. Aunt Alexandra rose and smoothed the various whalebone ridges along her hips. She took her handkerchief from her belt and wiped her nose. She patted her hair and said, Do I show it? Not a sign, said Miss Maudie. Are you together again, Miss Jean Louise? Yes, ma'am. Then let's join the ladies, she said grimly. Their voices swelled when Miss Maudie opened the door to the dining room. Aunt Alexandra was ahead of me, and I saw her go up when she went through the door. Her head go up when she went through the door. Oh, Miss Perkins, she said, you need some more coffee. Let me get it. Calpurnia's on an errand for a few minutes, Grace. Let me pass you some more of those dewberry tarts. Do you hear that cousin of mine did the other day? The one who likes to go fishing? And so they went. Down the row, laughing women across the dining room, refilling cups, dishing out goodies, and as though their only regret was temporary domestic disaster of losing Calpurnia. The gentle hum began again. Yes, sir, Mrs. Perkins, that J. Grimes Everett is a martyred saint. He needed to get married, so they ran to the beauty parlor every Saturday afternoon, as soon as the sun goes down. He goes to bed with the chickens, a crate full of sick chickens, Fred says when it's all sorted. Fred says, Aunt Alexandra looked across the room at me. She looked at a tray of cookies on the side of the table and nodded at them. I carefully picked up the tray and watched myself walk to Mrs. Merriweather. With my best company manners, I asked her if she would have some. After all, if Auntie could be a lady at a time like this, so could I. All right, we are done. You are done with the reading for today. So make sure that you answer your questions. Don't be afraid to look online at the prompt. We are going to be taking your test on Tuesday. Have a great snow day, and I will see you tomorrow.